Hey guys, thought I'd catch you up on one of my current projects. What we have in front of us is what I like to call Project Intervention. I'll get more into the name here in a little bit, but I figured we'd start with what it actually is. Those of you guys in the RC community, or especially the RC crawler community, probably recognize the base for this rig. It is, in fact, an Axial Wraith that I've had sitting around in the shop in kit form for quite a few years. When we take a closer look, we can see it does sit quite a bit lower. We have 1.9-inch tires on it, and it's quite a bit narrower than what the normal Axial Wraith is. Before we get to that, I figured I'd explain a little bit about the name. So what about that name, Project Intervention? Where did that come from? Well, as we take a look around my workshop a little bit, we can see I'm pretty fortunate. I have a good selection of parts and kits, a great space to work, and a nice collection of tools to work on my stuff with. But I do have one small problem. I have way more ideas than I have time, and that's where the idea behind this truck came into mind. That's where the name came from. The idea is that I'm going to take the parts or kits and tools that I have and make a rig from it without trying to spend any money on anything else. Now, not spending any money is probably pretty close to impossible. There are a lot of things that I have collected and do have a lot of, but there are some small things like servos and other types of materials that I'll probably need to do, so I gave myself some rules. If I needed money, I had to sell something to get it. So I went through my workshop, collected a whole bunch of parts and things like that I knew I wasn't going to use, and I raised about $260. So that gave me a pretty decent budget to work with, considering all the parts and the kits and stuff that I already have here. So now that you know the idea behind the project, I figure we'll take a closer look at the actual project itself. So let's take a closer look at what I have so far. As I mentioned earlier, it is an Axial Wraith based vehicle. I do have it mounted on some 1.9-inch tires. In this case, they are some Pitbull Growlers. I have Crawler Innovations dual stage foams inside, and they are mounted on some SSD double time wheels. You might have seen these wheels and tires installed on an earlier video. I had them laying around, so I figured it was good for this project right now. They are a little more flashy than what I would like to put on there. I have an idea of what build I would like to put these wheels on, so they're good for mock-up. Not sure if I'm going to keep them on this truck or not. We'll see as time goes on in later episodes as I progress through the build. As I mentioned, it is sitting on some narrowed AR60 axles. Those are the axles that come in the Axial Wraith kit. We'll take a closer look at that here in a little bit, but I did use the parts in the kit and modified them a little bit to get that narrower track width. Those of you that have already built the Axial Wraith might notice some other differences right off the bat. First, we have the Wraith Spawn interior here. I like that it's got the molded in driver. I think once it's painted up, it'll add a nice little scale detail while we're out running the rig. I think it's a little bit better than just having some empty seats. I've also performed what some people like to call a tummy tuck. What that means is I took the skid plate and mounted it up one bar in the chassis and removed the lower chassis rails that's normally there for some added ground clearance under the truck. And to achieve that lowered stance that I mentioned earlier, I used some Proline scale shocks that I had left over from another build. On the front, the lower mount is actually attached to the lower link mount. I'll show you that a little bit closer when we look at the front axle. And then here on the rear, I took the upper shock mount and flipped it 180 degrees, and it allowed the rear end to come back down to match the height of the front. Narrowing the rear axle is pretty straightforward, so let's get it apart and take a closer look. Even though the rear was the easier of the two, and I didn't have to modify the axle housing at all to narrow it up, because I had to make this bearing cap on the lathe, I'm not going to be able to call this a beginner modification. This bearing cap replaces the normal axle adapter that you get from Axial, and that's how I narrowed up my width. I also had to modify a Vanquish axle shaft here. This one's a little bit thicker than the stock one, so it helps take up some of that slot because it doesn't neck down after the tang that goes inside the locker. I did have to shorten it up. I used the lathe and my mill. You could get away with doing a Dremel and a file for this, but since I had the tools, I went ahead and used them. Making my own bearing caps is actually what allowed me to narrow up this axle. Without using the axle adapters that come in the kit, the axle is about the same width as an SCX-10 axle now, and you can see it still holds the axle shaft in just as the stock piece would. And then finally you can see I made the links out of 3/16 inch stainless steel. Tapped the ends with an 8/32 tap and finished it off with some Traxxas rod ends. Now on the front, we got a little bit more going on. You can see we have some SSD knuckles mounted on STRC axle Cs. I still have a narrowed AR60 up front. Got a high-tech steering servo. Not the strongest servo in the world, but it's what I had sitting around. May or may not change that out later. And then I used 2 axle trusses from SSD for one of their axles to mount my upper links. In addition to modifying a pair of axle trusses so I can mount my upper links, modifying the front axle took a fair bit of work. I also had to shorten the long side axle tube, reduce the outside diameter in the lathe, and cut a new bearing pocket. I also had to drill new holes to remount our lower link mount. Well, that brings us up to speed, so what's next? Well, I know I'm going to throw some power at this, and those stock gears are not going to hold up. So I took a little of my budget, and I spent it on some HD gears from Axial to replace the ring and pinions, and some steel gears for the transmission from Hot Racing. Next, I have to figure out what electronics I'm going to throw in this thing. I'm planning on going brushless. I have a Holmes BLE Pro to throw in there. I know I have a Castle BEC that I can throw in there, along with a whole bunch of other details that I got to figure out. And last but not least, I'm pushing myself to learn something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and that's 3D modeling and getting some parts 3D printed. I actually have some stuff in the works for this right now. If you follow me on Facebook and Instagram, you've probably already seen it. I should have those parts soon. Hopefully I can get them on the rig, take some new video, and share it in a future episode. Well, that's pretty much it for today. As always, thanks for watching. If you want to see more of this build, you can check it out on RC Crawler, Instagram, or Facebook. I go by the same username on all three of those sites, XSRCdesign. Thanks again, and I'll catch you next time.